Whilst I was posted in Kosovo, I received a memo from the head of my foreign service saying all of those who'd worked on Iraq were invited to testify to the first British official inquiry into the war, which was into the use of intelligence in the run-up to the war, a very narrow, specific thing. Blair had very deliberately designed it as a very narrow thing because he didn't want a full public inquiry into the war. And I negotiated with the inquiry that had been set up that I would deliver my testimony in secret. And I did this because I wanted to protect my career. At that point, I didn't want to give everything up. And I felt that I could have it both ways, which was a kind of clear indication of my moral ambivalence and, in some ways, my cowardliness. But I negotiated to give my evidence in secret, and I'm listed as one of the 2 anonymous witnesses to this inquiry, the so-called Butler Inquiry. And I sent my testimony off to London. And it was quite a long, detailed document explaining exactly how the British government had exaggerated the case for war, exactly how it had ignored available alternatives to war. This is a very neglected subject. We can talk about that at more length if you wish. But there were very much available alternatives to military invasion. But also how the war was illegal in terms of the resolutions that I myself had negotiated. I was deeply steeped in the resolutions on Iraq. I knew them, almost word for word. I knew a hell of a lot about WMD. I could tell you the degradation products of VX nerve gas when it had been sitting in a desert for 10 years. I could tell you the names of the special weapons regiments that Saddam's army contained. I could tell you the officers in charge of those regiments. So I knew my stuff, and I sent off this testimony, and when I sent it off, I remember very particularly the moment when I pressed the send button on my word processor in Kosovo, and realizing that there was something irreversible about this act. And a couple of days later, I sent my testimony to the head of my foreign service as my resignation, and said, I'm not coming back. He didn't reply. In fact, it was to my foreign secretary, and he didn't reply. And I quit and sort of jumped off a cliff. I had no idea what I was going to do next. And eventually set up this thing called Independent Diplomat, which is a diplomatic advisory service for marginalized countries and political groups around the world. Anyway, my evidence came out in 2007. I had been threatened with prosecution by my government and told by my union that if I made my evidence public when I resigned, I would definitely be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act, which is a very draconian piece of legislation. But eventually in 2007, I with an MP in Parliament, arranged this little ruse whereby the evidence would come out and I would be covered by parliamentary privilege because it had been requested from me by a committee of Parliament who I was testifying to about something else. The evidence came out and it led to calls for a full public inquiry because it was the first time somebody who'd actually been involved in Iraq policymaking had testified that the government's case was exaggerated, to put it politely. I think that heroic narrative of the whistleblower is very problematic, not least because it's very discouraging to people who might think of doing it. It sets up this kind of moral example of the sort of unimpeachable truth teller, which I think doesn't reflect the rather more coloured and confused and compromised reality of what we all are like. Had I had children, had I been 10 years older, I wouldn't have done it. There's absolutely no doubt. I would still be in the Foreign Office today, serving my time out in some, scummy little embassy somewhere.